Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Day Zero podcast. I'm Spectre. With me is Z. This is our last episode before our 2 week break, which we will be returning from on the 4th of January. But just wanted to front load that and let you guys know that this is the last one for 2 weeks. But we're ending off with a bang. So let's jump right into it. So CISA issued an emergency directive yesterday, calling on all federal civilian agencies to review their networks for indicators of compromise and to disconnect SolarWinds Orion's products. So this shocked me. This I think this is definitely the biggest news story in our space that I can think of since like Stuxnet. This was the fifth emergency directive they've ever issued, and this is also connected to the FireEye compromise, which also happened last week, which many of you probably heard about. Basically, it seems there was a backdoor in the supply chain, which was used to pass a malicious update to the group's targets that had its own backdoor. So the
Yeah, so
DLL would basically call out to remote network infrastructure to allow like second stage payloads and lateral movement and stuff like that. What was that, Z?
so we don't have a lot of information about how this compromise initially happened, especially like with FireEye with anybody else. We do know that this Trojanized update was used. It was digitally signed, but exactly how they got that Trojanized update. So they had an update that was signed and had a Trojan or like was backdoored to communicate with their CNC server and all of that, but it was posted to the SolarWinds website because your standard update process was just sysadmin would go to the website, see there's an update, grab it, download it, install it. It seems like these basically just hit that SolarWind update site looking legitimate because they're signed and everything else. But we don't really know much about how that initial compromise happened in SolarWind, or like it could have been one of their employees was paid off. It could have been an actual compromise. It does seem like indications are leading us to think it was more likely to be a compromise rather than an insider. And I'm basing that on the SEC filing for this breach. They have to obviously report that there was a breach, and in this report, they have mention of SolarWinds uses Microsoft Office 365 and its email and office productivity tools. They were made aware of an attack vector that was used to compromise the company's emails and may have provided access to other data contained in the company's office productivity tools. So that sounds to me like it's possible that that was the foothold that was used. We don't have much confirmation. This is the only time that's actually been, or this is the only source I think that actually mentions that.
Yeah, I didn't see that anywhere either. But yeah, this is clearly like a very sophisticated attack. So this is a far bigger deal than just FireEye was. For one thing, this attack was linked to APT-29 or Cozy Bear, which I think we might have talked
Has it
about with
actually
Anti
been
on the
linked?
podcast before. I think it from sources that I saw, there were unnamed sources that linked it to
There
APT-29.
have been, because it's been linked. I'm saying that with air quotes. It has been mentioned with a few different APT groups, but there has been nobody's really done proper attribution on this yet. I think you've got a
Attribution's
lot of
hard.
you've got speculation on it, but beyond that, it is just speculation at this point. I don't believe anybody has actually made a formal, like, I guess it's not really a formal process to attribute it, but like I wouldn't say that anybody besides Twitter has really actually attributed this to anybody yet.
You think it's too early to call it?
Not that it's necessarily too early. I mean, FireEye might know from their research into it, but nobody that I know of reputable has actually done the attribution yet.
Yeah. So the source size or the links that I was looking at said Cozy Bear, but yeah, that's fair. Like we don't actually know for sure. But it does seem likely that this is a state-sponsored attack, due to the complexity and stuff involved. And even
Complexity, the
FireEye mentioned
targets.
that too.
Yeah, no, and I definitely agree with thinking that this is likely a state-sponsored attack. Now, I'll admit, when it was the FireEye breach, we were talking about this just in terms of FireEye. Or, well, not talking about, but like when I was saying about that, it did feel a little bit weird, just because like FireEye was saying this was a very sophisticated attack, possibly nation-state actor. Yeah, like why would such an actor need to go after FireEye's tooling or their red team tooling? Like that just didn't really make a ton of sense to me. Because any like they're going to have their own tool. Like why do they need FireEye stuff? That said, this context now, seeing that obviously they're one part of a much larger breach, does make that, like, it makes a bit more sense. They also have to be using it, targeted on it. And obviously they do have other information of value. I think FireEye put a little bit of emphasis on their tooling. But I mean, if they perform assessments for any government clients, like that information, even if some of it's patched, is still very useful information for, an attacker.
So I guess since we're on the topic of FireEye, we'll talk a little bit about that and that breach as well. So they had a bunch of tools leaked. Like I said, even in the initial FireEye post before we had the CISA emergency directive, they suspected it was a nation state. They know their assessment tools were stolen, but they said they didn't have any evidence of them being used. They also didn't include any like 0 days or 0 day techniques. They made sure to point that out in their initial post. But those tools did contain frameworks similar to like Metasploit and such, as well as other scripts. So they've set up countermeasures, attempts to detect and block their tools. I think they released a bunch of like Yara and Snort rules and things of that nature. They have a public repository for that.
Yeah, that release does seem a little bit kind of half-baked, though. It does seem like, from what I know at least, that it would be fairly easy to get around some of those releases.
Thank you, Mr. Gate, for the sub, tier 1 sub, 8 months. So yeah, I kind of wanted to ask you about this, because I was having a bit of a discussion with some people yesterday around this. Do you think FireEye's response was lackluster? Because I initially thought when I was reading it, this was a decent response. It was as transparent as I thought they would be. But there were some other people who were thinking like they should have gone further, and these Yara rules apparently they say they suck and they can trigger like a lot of like false positives and stuff like that. So do you think they should have done more from FireEye's side?
Um, so FireEye as a company is generally not. Well, actually, I can't say generally. I know there are some people in FireEye that aren't a big fan of like releasing security tools. I don't want to say that's necessarily the company stance because I don't actually know if that's the case. I just know there is a little bit of that, at least inside, which is kind of a whole discussion to have over, is there value in releasing security tools? Or, should security tools be private? I mean, we can get into the whole Project Mayhem stuff and, cover all the history, but when it comes to FireEye's response, like I think in terms of a response to a breach, they have a ton of information, are releasing more information, like they're being fairly transparent about the breach. Should they have included more, like, I've seen some people saying they should release their tooling.
That's what I've been seeing most of, is people saying they should just release the tools since they were leaked anyway, and that way, this instead of just these flimsy signature checks, you have full binaries to work with. But I don't know if I agree with that. I think that's a bit unreasonable.
I think in the interest of security, like if we're going to say like what is the ideal security option, like what should they do just for the best security, then yeah, release them. That said, they're a private company. They obviously profit off of using their tools. They've built those tools, as part of their red teaming work. I can understand a company not wanting to suddenly open source their tooling just because it's been stolen. It's an interesting question though, because it is the security tooling that's been stolen, but I mean, if something like Core Impact was stolen, do we expect them to actually open source everything? It feels like we probably wouldn't, even though that would probably be better for like the security industry overall to have that, to be able to do better detection. I feel like they've done something. There's still time for them to do more. Like this is obviously a ongoing incident right now. So we might see them release that, but they weren't prepared to right now. It could be that the source code is just not in a state to be released, like could have information that they maybe don't want out there. I'm not sure what exactly that would be, but
Yeah, I mean, as much as from like a selfish point of view, I would like it if the tools were released. I think it's a very like slippery slope to expect them to do that because it's just it doesn't seem like a reasonable expectation to me. Um, so yeah, investigation is still ongoing there. But jumping back to the CISA issues, um, this gets much bigger because some of the potential customers, or actually the customers that are listed, you're talking like Department of Defense, U.S. Air Force, U.S. Treasury, Secret Service, U.S. Postal Service, Lockheed Martin, Visa, Mastercard, and Microsoft. I mean, you have a lot of confirmed breach targets and potential targets that could have been breached as well.
yeah, and I don't
Um,
remember if it's in this SEC filing or if it was somewhere else, but something like 400 out of the um, Fortune 500 companies run this,
that's
which is
crazy.
very significant.
I'd say so.
Heavily used, a lot of possible targets. Ongoing, that update was there for a while.
So, Microsoft was one of the confirmed targets that was hit. I have a tweet here from Kim Zetter. Said I have a report from Microsoft, including indicators of compromise. Excerpts from this thread: Microsoft security researchers recently discovered a sophisticated attack where an adversary inserted malicious code into a supply chain development process. Why it's I think Microsoft is probably the most scary one of the corporations that are on the list. Well, maybe next to Lockheed Martin. That's another big one too. But um, what's scary with Microsoft is, according to some other tweets that I saw, which I will also bring up really quick, um, it seems that they have integration with Microsoft Azure, which is for those of you not familiar, Microsoft Azure is like their cloud solution stuff. Um, if if it's integrated with Azure and those could have been compromised too, then you have like another branch of like anything that could have been using Azure is now also potentially like could have been hit here. So this is like crazy. The story got crazier and crazier as more stuff came out about it. Like I said earlier, I think this is the biggest thing since Stuxnet, and maybe this is a hot take, but I think this is probably a bigger deal. Um, so yeah, I believe the only targets that have been confirmed to be compromised, at least the last I read, was FireEye, the U.S. Treasury, U.S. Commerce, and Microsoft. Z, I don't know if you have any on it, other
Um,
companies to add to that list.
there is one, I don't remember. It started with an N. It was another U.S. department. Um, yeah, I don't remember what was it. Didn't seem all that important, but it was one that I could have confirmed, but I don't remember. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, it's not in the SEC filing either, but in the SEC filing, they do mention that they reported 13,000 of their clients like reported that they may have been compromised or were using the compromised version. Out of
So
300,000.
So I think it's safe to assume that if your company or government agency is using the compromised version, or the like the malicious version that was distributed, you probably were compromised, because it doesn't really make sense for a nation state sponsored attack to hit all of these targets and then just not pull any information from them. I mean, that was the entire point of the attack. So they probably got information from any agency or corporation that was using that compromised version. That is a bit of a stipulation, though. Like, if they didn't update to that malicious version, then they probably weren't hit. But that's where I kind of have a question. I don't know if you've had an answer to this. See, how often are these types of products updated in like the enterprise environment? Are they kept updated often to try to prevent issues like this?
I mean, ideally, yes. I can't actually say like what a Fortune 500 update plan would be on something like that. But I mean, this is tooling for the management of their infrastructure, so like if you're running that, you probably care somewhat about the about being updated and stuff, but it doesn't have like an automatic update, which I did find a little bit interesting, which would have made this
Much worse.
much more interesting. Yeah, if it had like some sort of automated update system. Obviously, I think a lot of their clients though are going to be running this in environments where just automatic updates probably aren't an option, like air gap networks. They just don't want connecting out. Although, I guess I'm saying that, but yet that doesn't make sense for the fact there was a breach and it did connect out. Because the actual methodology of the malware was that after about 2 weeks of being idle, it would connect out. So I'm obviously mistaken about that thought. But yeah, as far as I'm aware, there was no auto update functionality.
Yeah.
I don't know how often things like that would be. I would expect them to be reasonably up to date, although they are going to take some time to make sure it's not going to break anything. So I do want to touch on. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say that's what I found the most interesting part is that, this is like IT management product, and the mantra of IT, and something we said on the podcast a lot too, is to make sure you're staying up to date. And in this case, that's what screwed them. So it's kind of it's a funny twist of fate there. But sorry, you were I'll let you go on.
Oh, I was going to change the topic a little bit, and jump back onto kind of like the methodology. Because I did find it interesting. I guess I opened the wrong link here. But FireEye did put out a good post. I thought I had the link, but apparently I don't. Do you happen to have the other FireEye post link? Otherwise, I'll pull it up.
I thought I had it, but I don't think I have it either. So yeah, I think you might have to pull it up. I'm just gonna do a quick search, see if I can find it.
All right, so here's the other post there. The threat research, they put out this post yesterday, going into a lot of the details about the backdoor. This is where we found out that, okay, they were able to sign these things, which is actually kind of an important detail when it comes to this breach. Like, oftentimes when it's looking at those updates, is it signed? Okay, it's just kind of trusted because it is a binary. You don't have the source code access. You can't like try and build it yourself, so you just see it's signed. They do cover, and this is one of the few times this comes up in a somewhat positive light, but steganography, which I absolutely hate seeing challenges of steganography. But they do cover how they kind of hid some of their messages going back and forth, and part of that was that they pretended to be what was it, Orion Improvement, I think is what they called it. Yeah, Orion Improvement Program Protocol is what they masqueraded their network traffic as, and then they would hide information, the GUIDs and hex strings that were kind of present in some of that. So they made it look like a legitimate legitimate messages, did a little bit of hiding there. I just thought it was interesting to see that. I mean, from the exploit side, I don't really care for steganography. On the pen testing side, it matters a little bit more as you're trying to exfil data. Like, there's reasons for that, but I do like seeing it in terms of like, this is something that was actually used by a fairly sophisticated attacker. Out of chat, we've got the comment there of saying that the government sector should use fully open source software from Keenan 1099. That comes down to, is open source software more secure than closed source software? We see vulnerabilities in everything, and this was kind of at the supply chain. The same attack could have been performed against other systems. Now, there's a chance it will be caught if they have a repeatable build system, so you can actually like try and do the same build that would return the same binary with the same hash. But given that this was at the supply chain level, like, it's not an open source versus closed source issue, I don't think. There are benefits to open source. I am a proponent of open source software, but I generally wouldn't make the argument that, yeah, open source is just more secure. it comes down to funding. It comes down to the eyes looking at the software. Open source, can be extremely insecure if nobody's actually looking at the software. If nobody's looking at the code, who cares if it's open source? It doesn't matter at that point. It's like a band-aid fix for some that isn't, and it doesn't even fix the issue.
Yeah, and then you also have that point where open source is also a little bit easier to attack too, because you don't have to do any reverse engineering or anything like that to be able to find issues. You can do source code review, which is often easier to, at least initially, to start doing. So there's trade-offs with both. I think we could table that discussion for another time. I don't think we want to go too much into that here because we're already going to be spending a lot of time on this topic. But yeah,
but I do agree with you. Kind of one of the comments you were saying earlier there about this being a fairly big deal. Comparable with Stuxnet, because Stuxnet, was interesting just because it was, one, it was attacking like a nuclear system. It was subtle in what it was doing to try and mess up the Iranian research. This one's interesting in a different way. In one, it's attacking the US, potentially impacting a lot of the US government and a lot
it's
of
impacting
agencies.
way more targets. Yeah.
Yes. Which I'm going to be curious about what the attribution looks like on this one, but I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what the final impact of this actually is once they've actually figured out more. I'm especially curious on what the entry point was here to SolarWinds.
Yeah, these kinds of investigations can take months, so it'll probably be a while before we see anything on that. I imagine like the security departments at these like companies and federal agencies are probably on fire this week. Today's probably not a very fun day for them. But yeah, you were saying like this was different from Stuxnet and how it was interesting. There were some interesting parallels though, that I found like that were similar to Stuxnet. For one, that root cert compromise seems like a good similarity to point out. You kind of touched on it earlier. We didn't touch on it too much, but it seems like a cert. They were able to digitally sign this update, so they had a cert. The other thing was the subtlety aspect, right? You were
So they
saying
may
this took like
not
2 weeks to execute.
they may not have had the cert. That is kind of important there. This was signed. That doesn't mean they had the cert. What it does mean is that they were able to get it signed. So that could have been that they compromised somebody with access to the build system, but not so they were able to get it built. They could have been that they just injected this DLL like into that person who was able to build it. They were to inject it into their builds to get it included. It's not 100% certain that they've actually compromised the certificate itself. They very well may have, but it's just not clear at this point to say that they definitely did.
Yeah, that's another thing we may have to wait for more information to come out on.
Yeah, a lot of this at this point is speculation.
Yeah.
We don't have all the information yet.
One thing out of chat, National Telecommunications and Information Administration. I didn't want to comment on that directly, but that does remind me. I covered some of the companies that were potentially targeted, like Visa, MasterCard, Microsoft. There were also telecom companies in the US that were also potentially breached, like Warner Brothers. I think there were a few others, but yeah, there were some telecom companies potentially hit too. Like across like probably like every industry, there could be problems that come out of this. It's pretty incredible how widespread it seems to be. But yeah, we'll keep a lookout and see if there's any updates after like investigations are done on this. I think we will probably get updates in the future, just because it's too big of a story to just sweep under the rug after this week, So I think we'll get more updates and we'll be able to talk about
Oh
a
yeah,
little bit
I
more
definitely
conclusive stuff
expect
later on.
that we'll get more updates on this. FireEye, we were talking earlier about whether or not they've been transparent, but like they've included a ton of information. I mean, they've been breached, and they're in a very good position to have a lot of information about what happened and what's going on, and they have been sharing that publicly.
Yeah. I will quickly say as well, I think this kind of shows the need for an organization like CISA, because I think CISA was formed in 2015, right? Um, and like it'd be interesting to see what the situation looked like without an organization like that, because what CISA requires is all federal agencies, they had to not only um, shut down the product, the SolarWinds product, and anything that used it, but also they had to submit reports and look for indicators of compromise. And I think they're like legally compelled to do that by Congress. So it'd be interesting to see what it would look like if they weren't compelled to do that. I think the situation would
Uh,
be even worse than it already is. So
Yeah, I mean,
point in favor
there's
of CISA.
yeah, CISA has, and we've covered some other things coming out of CISA before. Definitely,
I think
I
zero
guess,
login was advised by CISA too, right? I'm pretty sure it
yeah,
was.
that sounds like something they would. But yeah, so following up with what you said though, reports had to be in by 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time today for all the agencies that were operating SolarWinds products. So they weren't given very much time at all.
No, it was a very busy morning for people involved.
Probably night.
Yeah. Yeah, there were probably people woken out of bed for this. So yeah, we'll move on because we spent like 20-25 minutes on that, so spent a little bit longer than we were intending to there, but we'll talk about Google. So Google put out a quick post on their Open Source Security Foundation initiative. Basically, they've released a new project called a criticality score, and this is used to indicate the product's critical impact from 0 to 1. And this is based on various metrics. So project age, number of contributors involved, user involvement, dependencies via commit mentions, and they even provide a way to add your own metrics into that if you wanted. Essentially, it's an implementation of an algorithm devised by Rob Pike. I can't really read out the algorithm to you because it's complex math stuff using logarithms and all that fun stuff. But the repo does have a nice little table. I'm just going to pull up the repo really quick. They do have a nice little table that shows all the parameters they look for and their weightings. So, for example, the dependencies and contributor count has a weight factor of 2, whereas the creation and updated since only has a weight of 1, and recent releases has a weight of 0.5. So, that table is like a really nice summary of essentially what this project is doing. It's not totally security related, but I thought it was a cool initiative nonetheless and could add value. They have public listings as well on a per language basis for like the top 500 uh, projects with criticality scores for like the cert whatever language they're talking about. So for C, the top project is Git at 0.94, followed up by the Linux kernel at 0.93 and 0.92. The higher one being the Raspberry Pi fork, which I thought was interesting, but I guess it kind of makes sense because there's probably a lot of projects that are based on the Raspberry Pi fork of the kernel. Number 4 and 5 are PHP and OpenSSL. So projects that you'd expect to be in the top are there basically. C++ had like TensorFlow and Bitcoin and some other crypto related stuff in the top 10. For anybody that's interested in seeing the projects that they evaluated, I'll get the link in the chat there. But yeah, they have like C, C++, Go, Java. They have a few languages in there with the top list. So sorry, I said top 500. It's top 200. I made a bit of a mistake there.
Oh well, now we're going to miss out on 300 of those. You should probably fill them in for us. Um, One thing I will say about this on a whole, it's an important move. We were just talking a little bit about the open force security. Or yeah, open source security, sorry. We were talking a little bit about that, and this ties in very much with open source security. There are a lot of projects out there that don't get a lot of eyes on, and there are some that do. I think the classic example to kind of point out here is stuff like Heartbleed and OpenSSH or OpenSSL, whatever it was. you had issues like that open source software, but just not getting a lot of eyes looking at it.
This could
Uh,
definitely help there.
this will help get eyes on the right projects potentially. I did notice that right now they are only covering what's on GitHub. Uh, they do say that these lists are derived from projects hosted on GitHub only, although they plan to expand that in the near future. But that is kind of a limiting factor here because there are a lot of projects like, I guess they do mention Linux kernel, but like even the kernel, is technically hosted off on git.kernel.org.
So
It's just mirrored over here, but it is over on GitHub at least. But
So I was about to say there, that actually does make me wonder. I wonder how this works with mirrored projects, because some of the metrics that they mentioned for calculating the score could seem like they would be hard to measure with a mirrored project. You wouldn't be able to get all the contributors, for example, I don't think.
no, you still
Unless
would because the
if it's a
contributors are
proper
part of
mirror, yeah.
the contribute. Well, I mean, yeah, I guess if they just do like a single merge everything whenever they do like a major update committed over on GitHub, then they
Yeah.
wouldn't. But like as long as it's a proper mirrored project, then the committers, even if they're not part of the GitHub system, will still show up in there. You'll still be able to see them in the commit logs.
Yeah, I've
No,
definitely seen some mirrored projects though that aren't like proper mirrors and they do exactly what you said and merge everything, and that would definitely mess with this scoring system.
yeah, on a whole, like I don't see anything really that stands out as crazy wrong or anything with how they're doing the calculation, their weightings. There's nothing that feels too off.
Yeah, I mean some of the metrics I wish they do have a bit of a justification for why they have the weightings the way they do.
Yeah, I
Like
mean, I would
why
love more
contributor
info,
count is
but
so like weighted so heavily. Because I guess the number of contributors does kind of matter because the more contributors, the more likely issues get fixed and the more likely new code gets introduced. But I don't know. I just wish there were a bit of justifications there.
it's kind of a metric of how many people are working on it. Um, and I mean, to some extent, if you have a lot of people, you also maybe have more risk of like an insider adding something.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
Oh,
So overall, I think this is really cool. One thing that does suck though is I did give this a try. You will get rate limited so fast. I did one project. I did one of the Open Orbis projects, and I got rate limited after doing the one project. I went to do another one, and it was like, "Oh, sorry, you have to wait an hour." Like, okay. So if I was going to do what you were saying earlier and add the additional 300, that would take me quite a long time. And that actually makes me wonder how they compiled those lists of like 200 projects per language or whatever when like I was getting hit with this rate limit. I don't know if they had like a some other endpoint they were using that they're not publishing. I don't know.
or
But yeah,
they just
you get
pay
rate
for
limited fast.
access.
It
I
could be that as
assume
well,
you
yeah.
can get around the rate limits with money.
Probably, yeah. So yeah, if you want to use it, you're probably only going to use it on one project at a time. But yeah, overall, I think it's a cool initiative, and I think it adds value, like I said earlier, to the open source community. All right, so we'll jump into some exploits. So vulnerabilities were found in McAfee ePolicy Orchestrator. This involved three exploit chains. It starts with an RCE via a CSRF, SSRF, and man in the middle chained together. The admin panel has a feature to verify if a database is running or not via this test connection functionality. Problem is the request query is sent in the post header directly, and there's no CSRF protection on that. So that allows you to alter the password of, I believe it's the super user account. They call it an SA account. I
Yeah,
don't know
super
if
admin.
super admin, right? Okay. Um, so yeah, that can allow you to authorize as that user and run commands through the MS SQL shell.
Yeah,
Second
so
issue,
I've. Oh, go ahead. I might get to it.
Um, yeah, no worries. Second issue is in the software extensions component, which allows installation of extensions. These extensions are zip files. You can guess where this is probably going. There's path traversals in the zip contents because, of course, this issue does require authentication to hit, though. And they also found a reflected XSS in the policy details card, which is probably the least impactful issue of the three, but it's also the only one that I think they got a CVE for. So that's pretty funny. Because the first issue was fixed in a cumulative update in 2019. So this might have just been a finding due to like a version incompatibility on the researcher side. I'm not really sure. The second issue, McAfee stated, was working as intended, and so it wasn't fixed. Their main reasoning was it's an administrator functionality, which I find kind of odd. I don't fully agree with that.
I mean, it could be that plugins, they intend to allow plugins to overwrite their own files. I think that is a sketchy decision, but it is a legitimate choice nonetheless.
There should be at least some kind of restriction though on like folders or whatever that you can overwrite.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's a sketchy decision when you start to allow that, but that could be their decision, or they could just be making it because it's an admin feature. We don't care. I do want to jump back a little bit on the whole man in the middle stuff though, with the very first exploits, that CSRF. Kind of the reason why that ends up happening. So it's part of, like, the actions are still part of the post body. It's just when you include. So first of all, it's not protected by any CSRF token. That they don't explicitly mention this, but it seems like that's just because this test aspect isn't supposed to be a it's not supposed to be a stateful action. Like, it just tests the database credentials and like connection information that you give it. It's not supposed to change anything. So because of that, they didn't put any CSRF protection on it. Generally, the recommendation is anything that makes a stateful change to the application should have a token on it. So in this case, with that one config call, it didn't have it because of that. And then that, of course, leads to a server-side request forgery. Basically, it's connecting to the database. They're able to man in the middle it, though. And I don't think you just touched on the fact they could inject, but effectively, if you control where it's going to try and connect and do the test with the database, all they do is they set it up to go try and test this attacker database location, I should say. Have it try and attack that, or try and connect to that, I should say, not attack. Tries to connect to the attacker. The attacker then reads whatever it does and tries to send that off to the proper database. So it basically just proxies it along, kind of man in the middle. But because it's proxying it along, they then control the query that it tries to do, and that's where they're able to inject the query to change the super admin password. But this does also mean that you need to have access to the backend database system that it is using. And you need to know the backend database system that it is using. So that means that for most attack scenarios, you've got to be on the same network. Because it's unlikely that they're exposing this on the internet. They might be exposing the database to the internet without any other protection, but it feels a little bit unlikely that that's happening, but that is kind of the case. It does restrict this one, I think, a bit. When you need to have an exposed database. Most systems aren't really just exposing it out to the internet.
Yeah, so it is kind of a cool attack. Practicality is limited, but unfortunately, like I said earlier, that issue was already discovered and fixed before the researcher reported it. So yeah, it seems there was like a version compatibility there. So the reflected XSS was the least interesting issue, and like I said, it was the only one that got a CVE assigned and was fixed. So, but yeah, there we go. 3 vulnerabilities in McAfee.
Yeah. So before we move on to the next topic, I did want to pull one question out of chat, which is just from Mark Arenas. But what is the best path to get good at exploiting stuff? And I think somebody else kind of answered that to him. Root email there. Practice, read write-ups, try to follow how others got there and see if you can reproduce it. Pretty much that. I'm a huge fan of open security training in their Introduction to Software Exploitation course. It's kind of like just getting started. If you know C and assembly, to jump into that. After that, there are a few other resources. but generally speaking, you've just got to get some of the experience, and once you've learned the basics, so that open security training course, maybe exploit courses, there are a few resources. If you're on Discord, you can ask me about. Uh, but once you've got those basics, it just comes down to looking at write-ups, trying to re-implement them, or just choosing a target and going at it and struggling and suffering through it for a while. It's really just, you get better as you get practice.
That mention of open security training reminds me. We totally forgot to add a topic for this, but Neo Kova did put out a tweet saying that he's going to be doing open security training stuff full time now. I think before he worked at Apple. I don't think he's working at Apple anymore. He's going to be dedicating all his time into open security training. So worth keeping an eye out on OST because there's probably going to be more courses and stuff coming out in the future. So that's some exciting news.
Yeah, I recall when that got tweeted out. Was exciting news, but we'll see what happens with that. I'm definitely hoping he's able to get kind of the funding out. If it looks like he's going for corporate funding.
Yeah. I'll also add on there. I'm a big fan of some people. A lot of people like to recommend CTF for learning security and stuff, getting into it. I will say I'm not a huge fan of that, just because CTF is, especially nowadays, like it's getting more and more gimmicky to the point where it's not really reminiscent of real world scenarios, unfortunately. I'm a big fan though of re-implementing like end days. I think that's the best way to learn because it is real world scenarios. Uh like artificial there's no artificial introductions. It's as real world as you can get basically outside of maybe like 0 days, which obviously is not what you want to start out with if you're just getting into it. So yeah, I'm a big fan of looking at write-ups and trying to re-implement stuff.
Yeah, I'll
So
comment on the CTF aspect. It is important. Generally, tell me if I'm wrong about this, but when you talk about CTFs and when I talk about CTFs, I'm thinking of the competitive CTFs. DEF CON main game or qualifiers even, Plaid. A lot of those that have these binary challenges on them are kind of focused in on that area, and not so much. I know a lot of people will call things like Hack the Box a CTF. I've always called them war games for the things that are kind of online 24/7. And I actually feel like like the war games can be a useful area to practice on. Something like Pwnable.kr, for example, has some practice binaries for you that you can go ahead and use. And like I think there's use in those sites, even our own 0x0539.net. Resources like that kind of generally are a little bit better than just the more gimmicky CTFs that are like the competitive CTFs from these modern days, I guess. They're generally a lot more accessible. They'll have more easy problems that maybe aren't interesting to the most competitive teams.
yeah, I will walk back a little bit and say a few of the recent CTFs I've seen actually have tried to go a little bit more real world. Like I think we covered one on the podcast, maybe last episode of the episode before, but they had like a Linux kernel challenge. Now the driver was like written by the author. It wasn't an end day and like some commonly used driver or anything. But I do like those kinds of challenges. I think those could still offer value. But unfortunately there are a lot of like CTFs that are just so gimmicky. It's like it's a situation that's only going to apply to that artificial binary. You're never going to find it in real world. So yeah, CTFs are a bit wishy-washy. It kind of varies depending on who's organizing it. But I think when you're talking about like end days and re-implementing them, and maybe even some of the war game sites, you have a lot more consistency with like quality when it comes to learning stuff. Yeah, that's where I'll end off answering that question.
Yeah, honestly, the more practice that you get, if that does come from CTFs, even though we're not necessarily recommending it, if that's what interests you and you actually enjoy that, by all means, as long as you're practicing, as long as you're getting that experience, you're going to be learning something.
Yeah. All right. So we'll move on to novel abuses on Wi-Fi direct mobile transfers. So this is about abusing a functionality provided on Android phones for direct mobile transfers. Primarily the fact that they rely on custom implementations, and those implementations have a shared design. So once a connection is established, any application running on the device that has internet privileges can interact with the file transfer client and server. They researched into three vendors and the technologies they use: LG Smart Share, Huawei Share, and Xiaomi Mi Share. I'm probably not saying that right. I can never pronounce Xiaomi. Um, but yeah, so LG Smart Share, they had probably the most issues. They had valid session IDs were not required to finalize transfers for one thing, and the receive port is hard coded. They're not using like ephemeral ports or anything like that. The session IDs are also very easy to guess or brute force. They're essentially just 0 to 100. And the file paths aren't checked and can be changed in the background from what's displayed in the prompts. Also, multiple files can be sent without any notification to the user. So LG seems to have lost the battle here. There were some other ones here that had issues too, though. Huawei Share seemed to be more secure in terms of design, but in terms of implementation, it was more buggy. They found multiple ways to crash the client and server services. And that's an issue because it's not just a DOS, because you can rebind to the same port after you crash the service and receive notify events to steal session IDs. And then finally, Xiaomi Mi Share basically had the same issue as Huawei Share, but through WebSockets. They do praise Xiaomi a bit here, since Mi Share is hardened more than the others by using per session TLS certs. But yeah, so it seems they kind of ordered them in order of least secure to most secure, with LG being the least and Xiaomi being the most. It's interesting though, because this is the first blog post I've seen that really touches on these types of design flaws with mobile file transfers. I hadn't really thought of it before personally, but that's also probably because I don't use this functionality. I don't care about these direct mobile transfers. It's just not something I use. So, but yeah, this seems this is the first I've seen of these kinds of attacks. I don't know about you, Z.
Yeah, no, I mean, looking at that, I believe, I mean, they do say at the start there it's novel abuses on it. It's an interesting attack surface that, yeah, I haven't really thought too much about. I think we've seen some, especially on Apple's thing. Oh, what is that? Like Apple Share, iShare, whatever they call it. Um, I don't think that's the name of it, but Apple has their over-the-air sharing. I think I've seen some attacks against that before. I think we even covered a brute force, like denial of service, on it once.
I want to say that we've seen stuff on Apple Share before, or whatever it's called. I can't remember either before too, but I can't remember when we would have covered it. So yeah, but yeah, it's interesting technology, and it's an attack surface that isn't really explored much. So we have an LPE in PsExec. So this is in a sysinternals tool called PsExec, which allows you to execute programs remotely. To facilitate that, it uses named pipes. In this case, PsExec SVC. Obviously, that pipe is going to be protected. Usually, only admins can read and write to it. Everyone doesn't have permissions, because that's a very powerful functionality. That is literally RCE. So the problem is, if you can create the pipe and reserve it first, or squat the pipe, um, you can obtain a handle to it. And unfortunately, the service it can have an unlimited number of pipe instances because they don't use the right flag, and the service doesn't check if it's the first instance. So this essentially can allow you to hijack the pipe, and this issue works all the way from Windows XP to the latest Windows 10. They were given a 90-day disclosure deadline, and they didn't fix it. So this is actually still a 0 day, technically, I
Yeah,
believe.
and this one is very, straightforward and simple. Um, Obviously existed for quite a long time. I'm surprised it's existed for so long. And I haven't seen anybody else write this up. I actually went and looked to see, like, has anybody else posted or written off about this issue before, and as far as I can tell, no. I mean, to be fair, like, your abuse of it does depend on somebody connecting to the machine and using PsExec, like being able to authenticate to the machine and doing that. So that, like, you're waiting on somebody to do that, so that does limit its usefulness, but it's definitely usable.
I will quickly thank somebody in the chat. Keenan said, by the way, you were probably thinking about airdrop. That's it, airdrop. See, like we don't even use these technologies enough to even know what they're properly called. So, um, yeah. So I mean, it's funny when I think about it. So many of the Windows issues we've covered on this show lately have been these like higher level design level issues instead of like technical deep dive exploits. Like the Windows print spooler stuff we've covered, print daemon, this topic. It
Pretty
seems a
much
lot of the Windows stuff we're covering.
all the file reader, like the sim linking stuff.
Yeah, that too. Like there's a lot of like Windows issues that just seem to be kind of more surface level, for lack of a better word. Which is interesting because Windows has been like trying to get better with security, and they have been.
Well, but
But
that can partially be why, because you do have a few more mitigations to deal with or potentially deal with on Windows, plus just the stability of an exploit. Um, on Windows can be a little bit more harder to obtain just because of like the inconsistency with syscalls and stuff. So because of that, like these higher AppSec level issues are just an easier target for a consistent exploit.
yeah, another thing I'll quickly mention is Windows. It's funny. Windows lower level is actually probably more secure than most. Maybe not Apple, but because Windows does have CFI, and I believe they have kernel CFI now as well. So they have a lot going on at the lower level, and that is actually a fair point. That might be why we're seeing a move to these higher level issues that are easier to hit. Just makes more sense from an attacker standpoint. But yeah, like you said, this does require some specific circumstances to exploit. I do find it weird that Microsoft didn't patch the issue in the 90-day window. I mean, we've talked about Microsoft in the past with being, kind of late with fixing issues and stuff, but this seems like the type of issue that shouldn't be super hard to fix. It seems like it would just be a flag change. So I don't know why it's taking them so long to push a patch out for this.
Sometimes things can be more complicated than it seems. Yeah, I don't know either. It's just, what seems like it might just be a flag change might actually be more complicated.
Yeah, maybe it breaks other stuff, or there was a reason they used that original flag in the first place. Hard to tell. But yeah, hopefully it is fixed at some point in the near future.
Yeah.
Keeping on the Windows train, we have another Windows issue. This one is from Project Zero, and it is a very complex issue. There's a lot of TLAs in here, and I really hate TLAs. But I'll
There
let you
are
continue, Z.
there are a lot of 3-letter acronyms in here if you're not familiar with that particular TLA 3-letter acronym. This one, it's just kind of really kind of in the dirt, I guess, or like nitty gritty with the details on this one. But the issue itself, I thought was kind of fun. So the issue here from the title is WAF FS control set reparse point X cache sign level SFB. Basically, what you're able to get here is you're able to get an arbitrary file to be cached as though it were to have the extended attributes set as though it were a signed file. So I think one of the key things with that, the way this issue ended up working, sorry, I got distracted by chat, is with the reparse points, if you're not familiar, you can set kind of on any file, on a directory, on anything like that, you can go ahead and set a reparse point, which effectively just tells the file system as it's parsing it to go, oh, I need to look at this data that's attached with it. So you set a reparse point along with some data that goes along with it. So your application will have kind of this overlay driver, a bunch of lower level file system concepts here. But essentially, you're telling the file system, don't parse this file as the file that's actually there. Instead, we've got this other data for you to parse instead. And that's using this Windows overlay filter, the WOF that you might see in the report here. And you would register a driver that would be able to handle that data. So this is like how NTFS will implement compressed files by compressing the file into kind of as that reparse data, and then just setting the tag on to say, yeah, this is a reparse point and reparse. So the trick here with this one, finally kind of getting into that, you take an unsigned DLL and kind of create your file with that. And then you add a compressed stream onto that. So setting the reparse tag, adding the compressed stream with a signed DLL. So that way, when you end up calling NTSec cache signing level, which is the thing that actually goes and checks, is this file signed? If it is, it sets a little cache entry or extended attribute entry saying, hey, this file is signed and we don't need to check it again. It'll just trust that. So when you set that as the compressed file as being a legitimate signed file, you end up with it, treating it as though it's signed, because it is. Like, that's the file it's reading. The kind of trick on this one is the fs control set reparse point x handler in the driver isn't actually implemented by the window overlay filter driver. So when you call it, you end up going off to the default implementation of it, which doesn't handle the fact that there's this compressed file attached. So you end up removing the reparse point, but you don't trigger the deletion of the extended attributes when you do that, leaving it to say this file is still signed, but when you remove that reparse point, it's no longer going and saying, hey, I need to reparse this file as whatever else and passing off to the driver. It's now seeing that original file. And there's a bit of a trick involved with keeping that original file there through some manual calls, but the gist of it was being able to remove that reparse point without actually triggering the deletion of the extended attribute saying that it was signed. End result, you fake this compressed file, which is now not handled, or you have a signed compressed file, get it treated as an uncompressed file where it's not signed and is some completely other DLL, and the kernel still thinks it's signed.
So, of course, I just got finished saying on the last topic that the issues we've been covering on Windows lately have been like surface level issues. This is the exact opposite of a surface level issue. I when I was like looking at this and hearing you go through the implementation, it makes me wonder, how do people like Forshaw find these types of issues? Like, how much research went into finding this bug? This seems like one of those bugs that's so involved that it probably took like months of looking at it, to like looking at the subsystems and stuff to like find this issue.
I mean, he clearly understands the subsystem.
For sure. I mean, we're talking
so
about Forshaw here, so
out of chat, the Mr. Gate asked, could a fuzzer have found it?
I doubt it.
It feels, because this is kind of a bit more logical too, rather than like a crash, because you don't get a crash out of this. This is just kind of like you have an issue where you're able to delete. And actually, if I had to make a guess, it was probably he was looking at if any of the default filters had functions that didn't, or that would get passed through to kind of the default implementation. That would kind of be my guess as to what he might have been looking for, and then reasoning about, okay, what can I do with this now that he found one? Yeah, that's a complete guess. But yeah, the fuzzers generally wouldn't find it because they usually look for a crash. You need some sort of, either this would need to cause the crash, or you need a sanitizer in place that would detect this and cause the crash. In both cases, I don't see it as something that would have been found by a fuzzer.
Yeah, no, this is the exact type of issue that somebody who looks at subsystems for months would find and just report on. Kind of like that Ian Beer Apple post that we covered on the last episode. Project Zero, and Project Zero, I think they mostly focus on manual review. I don't think they do. I know they do some fuzzing, especially for like the browser stuff, but
yeah, I actually
these types
did
of issues
a little,
are usually more manual review.
I actually did a little graph recently looking at all the issues that Project Zero has reported. And it's only a couple that have methodology fuzzing on it, and I think both of them were browser related. Generally speaking, it's all like manual assessments, static assessments. they might use some automate tooling there, but it doesn't seem like too many of them are being discovered through fuzzing from Project Zero.
I was about to say, I just noticed on the page it actually just says methodology manual right there, so
Oh
could
yeah,
have been a
very cool.
much quicker answer. um, I did want to address something you said though, like because don't fuzzers focus on the low hanging fruit and deeper triggerable bugs require hard work. There was we covered this a little bit on the last episode actually. I like Ian Beer's quote. Low hanging fruit isn't really a good way of generalizing what fuzzers find. Fuzzers find fuzzable bugs. And I know that sounds kind of dumb to say, but it's like there are definitely a lot of low-hanging issues that a fuzzer just wouldn't be able to find. And a lot of that comes down to what Z already said with you need some kind of indicator like a crash, and some of the lower hanging fruit bugs, if they're like logical issues, you're just not really going to be able to detect that with a fuzzer. Even if it does trigger it, you're not going to know it. So and fuzzers can reach deeper issues, especially when you're talking about smart fuzzing and coverage guided. But yeah, I mean, just saying that they find low hanging fruit is kind of I think it's something that's said a lot and isn't really true, especially not anymore. So yeah, just wanted to quickly address that. Um, all right, so I think we can move on to PS4. So a WebKit exploit was released by Mehdi Talbi and Quentin Meffray. I hope I said that right. I'm gonna go on as if I said that right.
Now, do these two do they have a like more known handle in the PS4 scene? I'm not really
No,
involved there,
no.
so
They're not really. They weren't really in the PS4 scene. They're researchers from Synactive, so I think they looked at it because they thought it was an interesting target. Um, I don't think they're really interested in like homebrew and stuff like that. Then again, I could be wrong. But yeah, I think that they just go by their real names. I don't think they have any other handles. So yeah, they were looking at PS4. They targeted PS4 on 6.XX firmware, and it could be made to work up to 7.0x firmwares, I think. It's a DOM-based use after free in the build bubble tree method, which is used for updating the layout of JS event handlers. Um, so there's this internal message object that gets used called a validation method. A validation message. And if that gets destroyed by one of those event handlers that gets ran, when execution reaches back up to that build bubble tree method, it'll operate on the destroyed object, and that's where the use after free comes into play. It seems the WebKit devs were aware of the possibility and they tried to prevent the issue, but they missed an extra dereference, which introduced a point of failure in the validation message instance. So WebKit is really tricky to exploit. It takes a lot of work. I could say that from personal experience. One of the problems they encountered was the fact that they had to fake a pointer to a method in order to avoid crashing. And that's because in the execution path, the .get method gets called when the bubble position is adjusted. And it seems you can't really prevent that method from getting called. Um, so in order to get around that, they used a really cool strategy. They used some heap feng shui to get to spray a bunch of HTML text area elements, and they try to predict the address of where one of them will land. And then they use that to try to fake the pointer so that when the get method gets called, it calls valid code. It's not just calling like an invalid pointer or whatever. So what's interesting here is there's two sprays happening with this use after free. They're spraying array buffer objects to overlap with that use after free validation message. That's really messing me up, that object name, as well as the text areas to avoid the crash. They then detail how they took the UAF to an arbitrary decrement by using the delete bubble tree method. They actually use that twice. They use it to smash a reference count on the message header to set up a relative read primitive to leak a array buffer view, and then they use it again on the array buffer view's length to get the relative read write. Once you have relative read write, it's a matter of just positioning an adjacent array buffer view and smashing the butterfly of that to get an arbitrary read write. Code execution from arbitrary read write is usually pretty straightforward. They reused a method that I've used in the past as well, and some others have used. They just use one of the text area elements they sprayed, and I think they just smashed the V table. So, in my opinion, this is a really awesome write up, and it does a good job of demonstrating the types of stages that are involved with browser exploitation. Going from something like a UAF to relative read write, or rather to arbitrary decrement to relative read write to arbitrary read write to code exec. You can see there's that multi-stage process that's involved, and that's the case across almost every browser exploit that you're going to see nowadays. Usually the implementation to move between the stages stays somewhat similar, and the strategies can kind of are portable between exploits, but how you exploit that initial foothold is always what's kind of unique. And I really like that strategy of spraying a bunch of objects to fake the method that gets called. It's a good way of using how WebKit works against itself. That's why I love it. There's people collecting metadata on PS4 to get this ported to higher firmwares, and I want to say someone already has it working on 7.02. I think it's just really unstable at the moment. I think they're trying to make it work a bit better before releasing it, although I might be wrong. Maybe it's already out there. I haven't
Well,
looked in a few days.
the end of this one does talk about them trying to brute force it on 7 point. I think it's just 7.xx, but
7.02, I think, is probably what they were targeting there. Yeah, it is really tough because PS4 has that added challenge of just sucking to work with. Um, when the browser crashes, the state gets so messed up. So yeah, it's hard to brute force. But how people in the community are getting around that, trying to port it up, is compensating for that by using numbers, right? Just getting a lot of data from lots of people and putting it together to try to estimate where in the heap that address is going to land. Um, so yeah, like you said, they attempted it, but they weren't able to get it done because I think they probably would have gotten it done if they had more time. But they had
well,
the
that's
black
always the
hat
case.
presentation.
That's
Exactly.
always the
Yeah.
case when it comes to brute force. It's a matter of time. You're always going to get it if you have enough time, but you may or may not actually have enough time. I will say I like this. I feel like we've almost been getting a little bit spoiled with write-ups recently that are including the exploit strategies and not just going as far as getting like EIP or RIP or whatever.
I like the trend.
Yeah, and we're covering at least one more, two more in this episode that will kind of do that. And I appreciate that because that is a really important step that we don't see for the exploit dev side of things. Is how do you leverage some of these issues? Like they are issues, but leveraging them can be very complicated and tricky. And so it's useful to start being able to see these patterns by seeing more and more exploits actually including that information, or more and more write ups including that.
Yeah. So I was a bit worried we might not get to see too much about this exploit for a while, because, like I said, they did present this at Black Hat EU, I think, which is a paid conference. But they put out the blog post and exploit code to complement it. I will definitely look out for when the Black Hat talk goes up because usually they do put the talks up on YouTube like a few months afterwards or whatever. So I'll definitely be keeping a lookout for that because I think their slides and stuff could be really interesting to look at too. But yeah, this is an awesome exploit. There's a really clever strategy here that could potentially be reused if you're in like a similar situation and a different bug. This could be a strategy you could take away and use, though it's not ideal. Ideally, you'd get an info leak, either derive it or use a separate bug. But if neither of those is an option, this seems like something you could attempt. And yeah, like I said, this is a perfect blog post for showing how you're basically playing a game of escalating your primitives of corruption to eventually get to that end goal of running arbitrary code. Browsers are just so much fun when it comes to exploitation. So whenever like blog posts come up about it, we'll definitely be covering them on the podcast. All right. So we have another article by Checkpoint. We like covering them on the show, though I think it has been a little bit since we've covered them. Um, This one is by Eel Itkin, and it's about some vulnerability research into Steam sockets. So, for those not aware, Steam is totally nuts when it comes to networking, to the point where they literally have their own networking stack. It's like a maze, and it's really amazing how well it works, actually. But as is the case with all networking stacks, it's a juicy target for exploitation. As the blog post points out, you can use it to gain competitive advantages by booting other players or crashing other players, crash the server, and there's lots of other possibilities you can have with that. And they ended up finding 4 vulnerabilities they found in the game networking sockets library. And in this blog post, they tunnel in on the most interesting one they found. They don't really detail the other 3. Um, but along with the vulnerability, they also detail some of the internals of how GNS works. And they mention the fact that it supports both TCP and UDP like messages in terms of reliable and unreliable messages. Um, Essentially, they send and split the message into unreliable and reliable segments, which are then reassembled. And that's why they looked at this system. Is packet reassembly is you can tell just by hearing what it's doing that it's going to be really complex code. Um, so yeah, when they looked at it, they found an issue. Um, when they load the offset, they load it into an unsigned variable, but when they pass it to the function doing the parsing, it's passed as a signed integer. So there's a signedness issue there.
Yeah, and this
Um,
issue, I've definitely kind of seen similar things before. Obviously, the signedness issue isn't exactly uncommon, but just in terms of dealing with fragmentation in general, um, the offset seems like a really common target and somewhere that is often just gotten wrong. So something to keep in mind. 'Cause yeah, in this case, the negative offset actually gets mapped into negative memory, relatively speaking.
yeah, so after a bit of work, they eventually managed to work it into a heap buffer underflow. It ended up being really challenging to exploit, though, because when the packet was being reassembled, the code didn't look for segments with negative offsets. So they had to kind of work around that. What they ended up doing was they exploited the standard library, the C++ standard library's map class. Specifically, they targeted the end method since map was being used internally for a balanced binary tree for the segments. I'm not going to go into the details of how they mess with standard library because C++ internals are hell when it comes to complexity. I don't even fully understand them. I don't like C++. Not to start a language holy war, but under the hood, it's an absolute mess to try to understand and exploit. But it seems they took it to a crash. I don't think they took it to like code execution or anything, sadly. But yeah, they reported the issues September 2nd. Valve fixed them September 3rd, and binary updates were shipped September 17th, which
So
that is crazy good turnaround time for Valve.
they took it. They only took it to a crash. And the main reason for that ended up being that part of what would happen is, so with this exploit, they would basically end up making it so the end object, as it's searching, because it would search for this offset, like Spectre was saying, it would start at 0 and it would search for this offset that's like negative. I think they were using negative hex 180. It would search for that. It would never find it, so it would keep going until it reached the end object. And then they made the end object, which is literally just a pointer past the last valid element. They made that element look like a real element. So the problem then is, after all of this, it would see that end element, do some things with, but it would end up freeing it. And that free is what broke the exploit. The free would be caught by TCML because, hey, this isn't something from the heap, or this isn't a valid like buffer that you could be freeing. We never gave you this buffer, and that's why it would crash. So it doesn't seem like at least this exploit strategy will be usable at all. It's not just like they need more work. It's the strategy seems like it just won't work. It's still an interesting attack, and there's still the potential to get something, just not with this strategy.
Yeah, unfortunately, sometimes your exploit scenario just kind of screws you. Functions get called that you just don't have any say over, and like you said, it just kind of it blocked them here, unfortunately. But yeah, what surprised me the most, honestly, in this blog post was the timeline. Valve fixed it literally in 1 day, and that is crazy good turnaround time for Valve. I feel like we've said that a few times recently. It seems Valve is really starting to get better with turnaround times on exploit reports because in the past, there's been cases where they've had open bug reports for months on end, especially on like their HackerOne and stuff. But it seems lately they've been getting faster and faster with fixing issues. So That's cool to see, and I couldn't believe that turnaround time. That's
Yeah,
really good. So
I feel the potential exploitability of this one is significant and most likely a quick fix.
yeah,
Um,
it could also be that it's not just a game level issue, right? Where it's in the Steam
yeah,
sockets,
it's
that's a potentially a lot more serious. So
yeah.
yeah. All right. So ZDI is back in the show after a bit of a break with a blog post on macOS. We have a macOS kernel out of bounds right. The issue is in the Intel kernel extension. I'm assuming for interfacing with the Intel iGPU. In one of the commands, they don't give the name; they just label it as hex 10005. It accepts a buffer from the client, and one of the members of the structure that's passed in for this command contains an offset for addressing into the buffer. And it seems there's just straight up no boundary checks on this. So you just get an out of bounds right for free. Seems like a very low hanging fruit issue.
Yeah,
Um,
it's unclear exactly how you get control of that offset, though. It is just the offset that has no boundary checks, like you said. But this structure, this command structure, is generated from this other command structure. So it's possible that it's literally just like the size that they do some work on, like add size plus however far into the array they are, whatever. Because you pass in an array of the first one, and then it gets passed into this process kernel command as a single structure of just one command at a time. So that could be kind of where it's coming from. It's unclear where they're getting control of the offset, though. I think at least I haven't seen them. I couldn't find them specifically mention where they were getting that from.
yeah. So the blog post doesn't really go into how they exploited it, but it does show a screenshot that seems to indicate that they did get code execution. They managed to defeat kernel ASLR and expose the kernel task port, which, as far as I understand it, in Apple land is game over. This was a pretty short blog post by ZDI. It's unfortunate we didn't really get many technical details around the like. I wish we had more technical details around the bug and certainly around the exploit. Although with ZDI, that's kind of commonplace. We don't always get the exploit details in ZDI posts. I still thought it would be worth keeping in the show though and mentioning because kernel bugs are fun to see details on, especially Apple ones. And related to that question earlier, I think it's another good case of an entry point that somebody who wanted to get into Apple security could play around with and see what they could do. So yeah, could be a fun exercise for anybody out there looking for bored and looking for something to do, especially where everything's going back into lockdown now. All right. So, abstract shimmer. We have a post from NCC group. This is related to the container D shim, which is used for Docker containers. So with Docker, for those who have never used it, you can create and run containers which may or may not use networking functionality. And something you can do is pass host networking functionality to it, which is not something that is advised, because it can lead to issues like the one we're going to cover here.
Yeah, it's not
So
advised, but sometimes it is necessary,
yeah,
depending on what you're actually doing from the container. Like, obviously, use it sparingly.
yeah, exactly. So when a container is started, an abstract Unix socket gets created which spawns a container shim process. The problem comes in when you allow a container to access that host networking and somebody has, I think they have to have root inside that container because they need capsysadmin capabilities. Um, but basically, the problem is they can listen for the creation of new abstract sockets because they have access to that host networking, and they can race to connect to it before Docker can. So that can allow you to access the Docker interface, which they were then able to use to overwrite their container configuration. They were able to obtain arbitrary file read write through the file URI that's provided through containerd. They also found you can mess with mounting of the rootfs directory to potentially wipe the real root on the host, which is pretty destructive. And they do put like a big disclaimer when they talk about that, saying you probably shouldn't do this if you care about your box at all. But yeah, I mean, this is mostly like a PSA of do not expose host networking if you don't have to, because these are just some of the issues that you can encounter when you do that.
Yeah, I thought this was kind of a fun issue. There were, like, one, just the racing for that. Like, because you can listen for anybody else or any other container opening that abstract Unix socket. You can know when it's coming, and then you just race to connect to it first. Like, easy, but I don't know. That's kind of, I don't know why, but I find that just to be a kind of fun issue. Like, really easy to kind of understand what's going on there. Then yeah, this post is actually goes pretty deep on some details. One of the other things they noticed during this, which I thought was a little bit funny, is that the Go implementation actually has maybe a bit of a mistake, I guess. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you'd call it, but when making a connection, it looks for the first character being an @ sign and then replaced it with a 0, which means you couldn't actually open a Unix sock to anything with an @ sign in it or at the beginning of it. Which, you know, probably fine in most cases. You're not really setting them up that way, but I did think it was an interesting choice because, like, technically you should be able to. And then Go's internals, makes that little change. They bring that up. They bring up a lot of details in this one. Like, we've covered the core issue, but they go into a lot of information. Another thing they get into is, what are the options to fix this? So you might think, okay, well, just use a pathed Unix socket. So use a proper path. Docker container isn't going to have that same path, and you're fine. Problems are that on that though, like, they start covering some the problems with doing that, and start looking at some of the other issues. So using the Linux security module options, so like AppArmor, SE Linux. And actually, I guess I should say, with using the abstract paths, the issue there is just they're able to assume that container closes, they're automatically garbage collected. There's no extra work to do that. If they're using it as a file-backed one, they need to do the cleanup. They need to detect all of the exit cases, which is more difficult than it might seem at first. So that's where the NCC group here starts talking about, well, how would you fix this? LSM policies, going into the issues there. Mostly it's containerd is kind of an odd place to be generating policies. I don't think they quite say this, but I'd say it kind of feels more like a hot fix or like a band-aid patch for an issue, rather than actually using that as your your primary security mechanism on this. Talk about token authentication as another option, which just can't really be backported easily. No real mechanism to prevent brute force. So they mentioned timing attacks, but like doing a constant time comparison should be able to deal with that. Just not using equals. And they had another actually interesting one using the PID of the caller and then getting obtaining kind of the pure process Unix credentials of the socket, of the process accessing the socket, and comparing that PID to the raw namespace ID values. Does kind of fall off with issues of PID reuse. We've talked about that before, or PID recycling, but they talk about a few different options here, which is really interesting because oftentimes, maybe if you're in the security industry, you're not just finding the issues, but you need to have knowledge on how to recommend a fix for them. So it's interesting to see what they actually recommended here. I wasn't aware of this PID one as a interesting take. A little bit hacky, but still an interesting take on like a possibility if nothing else is going to work. And obviously they did mention like it is still exploitable.
Yeah, so I will quickly mention again, you would need root inside of the guest container to be able to pull this off, because you need the caps sysadmin capability, which if your security doesn't suck and you have to run a container that's using the host namespace, and you're probably going to try to secure that container so that somebody can't get root inside of it. But if they do, this attack does become feasible, but there is that barrier, I guess, that I'll point out. So,
yeah, there is that barrier, but it's worth noting, like getting a compromise of a it's kind of similar to kernel privilege escalations. There's usually that barrier if you need userland code execution. It's kind of the same. We're just talking about a Docker escape in this case. But it's still kind of the same issue. Like, yeah, it is just a Docker escape, but it's still very relevant.
Yeah, it's fair. All right, so we'll end off our exploits with two vulnerabilities, one in Node SAS and one in PNG image. So we'll start off with the issue in Node SAS. This occurs when reading a SAS file and parsing the indent width. They allocate a buffer to hold the indent characters on the heap, but they add one to it when allocating it and use the original size when doing a stir copy. So there's an integer overflow there, because if you pass something like -1 in, when that one gets added to it, it'll end up passing 0 to malloc, which for those who are not super familiar with libc, usually that will end up with an 8-byte allocation since that's the minimum size. Malloc 0 will not just fail, which I think it should, but I guess that's a disagreement on with libc devs with how that should work. Then
Yeah, I
the
will
negative
mention,
size is past the stir copy, so you get a large overflow.
it is only with indent length -1 that you get this issue, because they're only adding one. Like, there are no other values that you can get the wraparound with except -1. Since you had said numbers like -1, I did want to clarify that.
Yeah, and that is actually an important point because this is probably not exploitable. Actually, I'm going to say it's not exploitable because you would need to interrupt that stir copy. When you're passing something like a -1 to stir copy, it's going to treat it as an unsigned value, which is going to be an extremely large value, like 2.1 or whatever it is. You're going to have a lot of bytes. The entire heap is going to get smashed, and you're going to run into unmapped memory. It's pretty
Yeah,
much
there's
impossible to not crash in that case.
yeah, there's pretty much no case you're not going to crash. You don't have control over the data being copied either. And they mention actually both of those points in this when talking about the exploitability. And I do want to say this article itself, it's actually part 2, where it's exploring these native code that maybe you don't always notice. So the first part, they were looking at the native code in the runtime, where you might be using Node, but there's a lot of that JavaScript processing that happens in C. There's a lot that gets processed there. This one is looking at the glue, so for foreign function interfaces, where you can write a little bit of code that'll translate basically between the JavaScript in this case and the C. And that's where this issue was. I think that's an interesting attack surface that hasn't gotten a ton of attention, that specific glue code. Obviously, the runtimes do get some attention. But this specific glue code, I feel like maybe isn't looked at quite as much because it's usually very small. If you've only got, like in this case, they've got roughly, 3 source lines. I mean, they've got more lines, but roughly you could say 3 source lines if you combined everything up. It's hard to have issues in that small of code, but obviously, we can see that they do. And I just think that's an interesting attack surface to be looking at. So I want to kind of call out what this post was about.
Yeah, something a lot of people skip over. The second issue is a bit more interesting. It's in PNG image. It's another heap overflow related to parsing, this time when parsing the rows for PNG data. They allocate an array to hold the data, but they multiply a user-provided row height by the number of row bytes. So you can see that multiplication, you have another integer overflow case. Part of why this is a more interesting issue, though, unlike the first one, is you can actually interrupt the writes so that you don't just smash everything and run into unmapped memory. And that's because once it runs out of user-provided data to parse, it'll just error out. So how they exploit this is they manipulate the heap to get near a link map chunk, and then they smash the relocation table to index it to a fake symbol table to get code execution. So that's kind of an interesting strategy. It would work with if ASLR was used, but I think you couldn't have Pi enabled.
Yeah, so their case
position independent.
With this one was with the Pi. Was without Pi.
Yeah.
Kind of the keyword, though, if you want to look into kind of that strategy, you're going to see something similar, not quite exactly the same, but ret to DL resolve would kind of be the generalized, at least a similar attack to this, returning into DL resolve. Kind for a keyword if you want to Google more, although they include a ton of information in here. Key difference there is that attack also requires that you control the call itself into the runtime resolver. It's taking advantage of like the global offset procedure linkage table work, how it's going to resolve certain things at runtime. So it does also depend on that full railroad is not enabled. I think you can still do this with partial or nothing, but you can't do this with full railroad, or at least their exploit strategy.
Yeah. For anybody that's interested, ELF stuff, like how executable linkable format works, is like really fascinating. I had to do a lot of like reverse engineering on that when I was doing and research on that when I was doing some PS4 stuff, and it is a really fascinating format, and I kind of like this exploit strategy because of that. Yeah, one thing I wanted to call out from the blog post is actually the very first paragraph. They say this is in the first installment of series on native attack surface of interpreted languages. So it seems like that's going to be a theme that's going to be continued throughout future blog posts on the on GitHub Security Lab. So that'll be kind of interesting to see, because like you said, that is kind of a skipped over thing. Like, a lot of people see interpreted languages that are inherently memory safe and they think, okay, well, there's not going to be any memory corruption here, which, for all intents and purposes, seems reasonable until you consider that there is that glue layer. There does have to be that interoperability, and that's where you can find these types of issues. And I think it's cool that we're going to be getting more blog posts on that.
You're kind of limited though in a lot of cases with how much of it's actually exposed. I mean, so we had this node SAS issue. How many scenarios can you think of where user provided data is going to end up being passed in there, where they're going to have that sort of control? You just don't have any way of actually, like, there's basically no case I can think of in a normal application where you could possibly have access to make that call to even control that information. So it's a self-attack, and it's not even a escalation of privilege. Like, assuming it was exploitable, it's not even that. Like, it's user to user if you've got that level already. Now, there's probably some random application out there that just exposes it for some reason, or specifically to be vulnerable because it's a CTF. Like, that's a possibility, but that's the problem with attacking a lot of that glue code, is it also has to be exposed in a way you can hit it as an attacker. Which makes the ping one kind of interesting, because that is in the ping file. You can imagine upload scenarios where you can get access on that. You'll upload a PNG file that gets processed. Like, that's possible. But that is why some of them aren't looked at. And when it comes to the language runtimes, PHP gets looked at a bit, because there are a lot of cases where you kind of end up in a sandbox PHP. Java used to be really common for that, actually, looking for runtime issues. Just because if you can do that, then you get Java applet in the browser, and you can run away with code execution after that. Since Java introduced the signing everything, or needing to sign it to have access to something more privileged areas, that has been less of a thing, and obviously Java applets are kind of being phased out in general. But I mean, yeah, you're left at it's a hard attack surface to hit, is kind of what I'm getting at. So it will be interesting. That said, the first installment was like 6 months ago, and now the second installment. So I don't think we're going to be seeing this as like a weekly thing. It'll be a while. I would like to see more of it, because it is still an interesting case. Like I said, this ping one especially is hittable. And as a write-off, like, this is a very detailed write-off. Like, there's
that's a good shout on the exploitability aspect. I did just want to quickly go off topic for a second and say, you call PNG files ping files? I've never heard anybody say that before.
Oh, well, yes, I do.
That's fascinating. All right. I've known you for a while, and I've never heard you call them that. So, all right. Ping files. Maybe I'll start doing that too. Makes it easier to say. Yeah, sorry. Did you have a final thought on that though? Before we move into
Oh,
research?
yeah, actually, not actually related to the exploit, but I do want to call out that he uses Jeff in this, GDB enhanced features. And just a reminder to everybody, um, if you're still out there using PETA or GDB init, upgrade, please.
I'm a PETA stan, okay? I really like PETA. I'm gonna keep using it just because you told me not to. No, I do like PETA, and I've been meaning to try it, Jeff. I just never got around to it.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
it has more features. I mean, PETA just isn't like. I mean, if you really like PETA, fine. Like, it's not like you're opening yourself to be exploited or something. It's not being maintained anymore, as far as I'm aware. Um, GDB enhanced features has a lot more enhanced features than even PETA does. I just wanted to shout it out as like, if you're not aware that there are other options, there are other options. And for those asking in chat, clearly it said GIF.
I was about to ask you about that. But
I say
yeah,
GIF.
I usually say GIF, but sometimes I do say GIF. But depends on the time of day, I guess. Could you upload the stream to YouTube for future reference? We always upload the VODs on YouTube, usually about 24 hours after the stream, just because we have to do that because we're Twitch affiliates. So, but yeah, they're on YouTube and they're also on like Spotify and stuff like that. All right, so we'll move into our research topic. So this was an interesting blog post into PDFs by Portswigger, who we've covered as well in the past, and it talks about how hyperlinks can basically give you injection into a PDF and how that can be used to exfil data to a remote server. And this is because of the fact that PDFs are super powerful. I've said it before. I don't think people realize how many functionalities PDFs actually provide. They allow input for things like forms and annotations and stuff like that, and that's where they're targeting with these injections, particularly on the annotations. So they go into some background about how PDFs work internally and how like text nodes are managed. Internally, they're enclosed inside of parentheses, and they went into researching into a bunch of like PDF libraries to try to pull off an attack on if you can inject parenthesis, breaking out and seeing what you could do there. They ended up focusing on two that they found that worked, PDFlib and JSPDF. With PDFlib, they were able to use annotation URIs as a point of injection. With that, they were able to inject and run JavaScript. So using JavaScript, you could exfiltrate the PDF data over a post request, or you could use the form submission functionality. You didn't even have to use the JavaScript if you didn't want to. With JSPDF, it's
Well,
it's very similar.
the form submission, you still needed to, like, you either need somebody to actually click submit on the form if you want it to be actually automated. Then you need to use JavaScript to force the submit of the form, but you were able to have the entire form get posted just by setting one of the flags in that form.
Yeah. JSPDF had a similar issue. They were able to inject through the annotation link URLs. Um, Another thing they wanted to try to pull off with this attack was PDFs loaded from the local file system instead of in the browser. This is a little bit harder because of the tricks they already used. They would result in a prompt to confirm submission of the form, like you kind of talked about there. So they wrote in the numerator to try to look for functions that would call out to a server without prompting the user. They ended up finding one that would cause a DNS interaction, CB shared review if offline dialog, and then they could use the DNS as a medium to exfil the contents of the PDF. Now, with both PDFlib and JSPDF, initially their injections required user interaction to click the link for it to trigger. But with JSPDF, at least, they found a feature in the JS or in the PDF specification that allowed them to get it to run automatically with zero click. And this is using PV entries, which I looked at the PDF specification quickly because unfortunately they didn't really include exactly what those were. But basically, they're used to describe actions like events to be ran when the page containing the annotation is shown. Now there is some additional stuff in the post that I'm not really going to cover for brevity's sake. But a bonus thing that they included that I thought was cool was the mention of this being used for a SSurf attack. Um, you can you can send post requests as mentioned earlier, but mainly what they talked about there was using it to exfiltrate data. But you could also use it to send arbitrary data, including new lines. So you could potentially chain that with like request smuggling or something like that too. And I thought that was kind of an interesting attack strategy that they mentioned there. Um,
Yeah, this whole post, like, I remember some years ago I had a scenario where I was able to inject into a PDF. I didn't end up really taking it too far besides just a JavaScript alert, but I remember trying to look for information about other people who have done that. And this is really one of the first really good write-ups on trying to exfil that I've seen. Now, he does actually mention at the end a couple of resources, so perhaps I've just missed some of them. Um,
yeah, I think there were like
Nonetheless,
some conference presentations and stuff, but
yeah,
I
I'm
don't
not
think there was much
sure.
beyond that.
Yeah. That said, this is still like it as usual out of Portswigger, like their team does good research. And useful research that like this, even though he only covers that the two were actually vulnerable, there are scenarios still where you can end up injecting into a PDF. Um could be outside of JavaScript. I think the one that I had was a Python application.
Oh,
Um
that's interesting.
yeah, I don't know what library I was using. It was Blackbox, but I mean, it's just it is a scenario that outside of going for the alert, I haven't really looked too much into it, but it's always kind of been there on the back of my mind too. You know, like what more can you start doing with it? And I mean, especially for like pen testers who are going to want to leverage some of these issues, definitely worth being aware of. You know, how to go and leverage like CSurf out of it and stuff once you get somebody to open it.
It's interesting because it's another one that follows that theme of something you don't really think about as a potential target. Like, you don't really think about input into PDFs, and, like, even somebody in our chat was like, "Wait, you can execute JavaScript in the context of PDFs?" Like, PDFs are one of those things that are just people don't know how wild they are, and, like, the bonkers levels of capabilities that they can expose.
Yeah, I
It's
mean
just
it
crazy.
has gotten better now with like or PDF and whatever Firefox calls their PDF reader, which are a lot more limited in functionality. But you know, like Acrobat being one of the main PDF readers has a lot of bloat within it. Um,
It's Adobe, so bloat
yeah,
is in the title, I guess.
I mean it's just growing so much over the years, and they keep adding and adding and adding to it. Yeah, it's just one of those things that like because PDFs have been a long time attack vector. Mostly in the sense of using macros and just malicious or not macros, but using malicious PDFs as a point of compromise and using vulnerabilities in PDF readers. Like those have been for a while. This one is a little bit more interesting. Just because of that injection attack, like it's not that uncommon when you're able to control something in a PDF. It is a little bit more uncommon when you're able to actually get the injection and like from that control. A little bit less common, but I mean it's definitely there. It's definitely a scenario I've personally been in. I'm sure others have too. So I want to call out this research.
Yeah. It just seems like a lot of the capabilities of PDF exposes seem like wildly unnecessary, and I don't see like. Have you ever used annotations in a PDF? I know I haven't.
Um, maybe I can't
Maybe.
recall a
Okay.
specific time, but I very well may have.
Yeah, but I don't imagine like some of those features are used very often. They're just like unnecessary attack surface. I like the discussion in the chat. NES PDF emulator ETA when and can it run Doom? That would be fun to see. That could be a. I'd love to see that, but I don't know if it's that powerful. I don't know. I mean, I guess if you got code execution in it, you could probably do something like that. But that's probably the only way you're getting something like that. All right, so we'll begin winding down the show with some shoutouts. Z, I know you have the first one here, so I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, kind of on the same line with the research. I just wanted to shout this out, but Hacker Scrolls, they put together a hacker scroll of CSRF, or not CSRF, sorry, SSRF or SSRF. Um, in terms of going from your SSRF, how do you leverage that for more? How do you get information out? And just kind of a mind map of how do you utilize that, which I think is a really interesting mind map to put together. Because there are like so many different options, and obviously there's going to be probably things that aren't on this list, some more creative ideas, but they cover a lot of your key things that you should be thinking of when you do have a SSRF issue. So I just wanted to kind of shout it out as something to check out. And they do have some other scrolls that looked interesting. I I think they had one for iOS, but the same information, if I recall, was still pretty relevant for just Android apps too, or it might have been a mobile one. But yeah, they just put out this SSRF one to take a look at.
So I have a shout out as well. HackerOne is putting out a 12 days of hacky holidays. Just wanted to quickly shout it out. I saw it promoted on Twitter. Um, we've gotten a lot of questions in the past with like where do I get started, and this seems like a fun place you could potentially look at. Plus we cover HackerOne issues a lot on the podcast as well. As I understand it, these will mostly be web challenges. It doesn't seem like binary will be a part of it. So if that's your thing, then you may just want to skip it. But I thought it was worth giving a quick shout, and if it looks interesting to you, that could be something you could do if you're bored over the holidays or whatever.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of well, Hacker One, their normal CTF, so they do have kind of a long running war game, which you can use to get invites. My assumption is that this is similar to that, and if that's the case, um, then a lot of times, like, they give you an application, you already have to know a lot of the issues, and it's kind of a test to see whether or not you know how to test. And thus you get access to private programs. And they say with this one, each flag gets you up to 3 private invites to private programs on HackerOne. So I'm going to assume like this probably isn't the best place to go if you're trying to learn. This is more of a place that you go like if you already know and just want to play around and test yourself a little bit. That said, I have not done their Christmas one here, but my feeling is that that's probably kind of the route they've gone because they are still offering the private program access. So yeah, just being aware of the fact that like it's not great for beginners to learn through. Like I wouldn't recommend this or their normal war game as a learning resource, but it is fine for like testing and getting a feel for whether or not you're ready for actual bounties, I guess.
Yeah, and helping you break into some of those private programs for sure.
I've heard a lot of them that you get access to through their CTF aren't the best programs, aren't that great. I'm not sure how
Oh,
that
really?
exactly
That's
works, but
unfortunate.
I've heard from a few people that they haven't gotten any good programs out of the CTF invites.
Oh, okay. So Z, I know you have a final shout out along the same vein.
Yeah, I figured I'd mention one other one, which is the Sans Holiday Hack Challenge. I think their reward is a little bit better. You get a free Sans online training course of your choice. They're only giving it out to one person with the overall best answer. Again, a lot of these issues are going to be more web. They do have some kind of forensics, more defensive questions too. So I do like kind of the holiday hack just because of that. Like it's a little bit more of a mixed bag in terms of the challenges. Still not much when it comes to the binary issues. But I did think it would be fun to point it out. And like I said, you can get one of the Sans courses through it for having the best overall answer. They do have some other things like most creative answer that's technically correct gets a pass to attend RSA conference. And best technical answer is a subscription to NetWars Continuous 2 for 4 months. And then 7 people at random will get a t-shirt.
I just noticed I was looking around on the site when you brought it up, and they have a free album, which I thought was kind of interesting. And while you were talking about the prizes and stuff, I was listening to some of the tracks out of that free album, and it seems like it's a Christmas spin on like hacker like synthwave type stuff, I guess, that's usually like associated with like hacking and stuff. So that might be cool to check out. Maybe I'll give a listen to a few of those tonight. But yeah, I thought that was kind of funny. The free album, hey, that's a nice little bonus that goes on top of it. But yeah, I think the big thing here is probably the prizes. I think you mentioned I can't remember. I was listening to the music, so I didn't hear if you mentioned it.
I
But
did mention all the prizes there, and I do think
you
the
did mention
online
all of them. Okay.
course, yeah, I do think the online course is kind of a big deal, just because that is like a $7,000 to $8,000 thing.
There's a lot of value there, yeah.
Yeah, but it is just one winner of that.
Yeah. All right, so that pretty much sums up all of our topics for this episode. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. Once again, this is our last episode before our 2 week break. We'll be back on January 4th. That said, you can catch the VODs on Twitch or on YouTube at 6 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Pacific on Tuesday after the stream. We also have previous podcasts up on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and Anchor. Go ahead and join our Discord and follow us on Twitter for updates. We'll still be posting there over the next 2 weeks. We just won't be doing the podcast. You can find the link in chat or in the description of the video. And we will see you all again after the break.